it's very strange for me to be here in the United Nations, because in the mid-80s I worked in the Office of Legal Affairs. I was a UN staff member, a senior legal officer in the Office of Legal Affairs in the UN Secretariat on the 34th floor. And coming back here today and sitting with my colleagues, Ambassadors Gold and Prosor, it's slightly emotional for me to be back here in the UN, because I genuinely believe that this is an organization that should, in accordance with its charter, do or fulfill the charter functions and purposes, and could be far more effective than it is today in achieving these aims. Perhaps the most neglected and central component of international terror is the element of incitement. Incitement's the medium through which the ideology of terror actually materializes into the act of terror itself. Without generating the circulation of the ideology and the recruitment of support as a result of incitement, there simply wouldn't be an act of terror. One of the central and essential requirements for achieving and sustaining meaningful, peaceful and trusting relations between peoples is the mindset, the will and the psyche of peace and bon voisinage, the mutual trust and respect that has to exist between peoples at all levels, both among the leadership, but even more important, among the general public. If the general public is taught to hate the neighbor or the enemy, then there's no chance of establishing peace between neighboring countries. Peace and mutual trust cannot and is not achieved through signing of treaties and agreements only. I've taken part in negotiating and drafting virtually all the agreements between Israel and its neighbors. And however full these agreements may well be, until there's a genuine will among the neighboring people to live together peacefully, these agreements are very good, legally speaking, but they don't mean anything. It has to be ingested into the public psyche and nurtured in every aspect of day-to-day life. But if indeed incitement is so obviously and clearly a central component of terrorism, the question remains, why does the international community in general, and international law in particular, not entertain a crime of incitement to terror or an appropriate international convention among the 15 to 18 or so existing counter-terror conventions that have been drafted in this building? Is it sufficient to rely on a vague provision in these various conventions prohibiting the support or the encouragement of a particular act of terror that's criminalized by the convention, and viewing incitement as constituting a direct or indirect part of such support or encouragement? Is it a justifiable response to claim that criminalizing incitement in an international convention would be endangering or violating the constitutional right to freedom of speech, First Amendment? Is there no clear dividing line between incitement to terror and the fundamental right to freedom of speech? Is it logical and tenable that the person who incites others to commit acts of terror, whether such a person is a speaker on a street corner, a preacher in a mosque, a radio or television personality, a trade union activist, or a teacher in school or college, can go scot-free after having played such a major role in generating the act of terror and bringing about the murder of thousands of people? No peace process can be expected to prevail if it's constantly and systematically being undermined by a pervasive policy of incitement and indoctrination, of fear, suspicion, and hatred against the other side, emanating from the highest levels of government through the religious, social, cultural, media, and educational systems, down to the youngest and most impressionable kids in the kindergarten. It's reasonable to assume that a culture of mistrust and hate fanned by constant religious and public incitement, inevitably would lead to violence and terror, and as such undermines the concept of peaceful relations. Incitement of youngsters through the education system in kindergartens, schools and colleges, and incitement and manipulation of the general adult community through the electronic media has become one of the major tactical weapons in the arsenal of various regimes. And in Israel, we feel it and see it, as Ambassador Prosor said, in the societies that surround us. And it's also in the arsenal of Arab societies in general. Similarly, and no less powerful, the growing trend to officially glorify terrorists through posting their pictures in classrooms, dedicating streets or public squares to them, or repeatedly airing songs and videos glorifying such people. All this clearly constitutes an integral component of the more subtle use of incitement to manipulate the mindset of the public. But while such incitement in the past and before the era of mass media and the internet had been relatively local in scope and largely restricted to specific communities of mosque attendees at Friday morning prayers, the industry of mass use of incitement to manipulate and influence millions has now become a very realistic and caustic weapon. Spreading unfounded rumors by word of mouth from village to village, whilst in itself something that caused a lot of killing and violence, it's no longer necessary today when a tool like Al Jazeera has the capability to incite millions through televised images and nuanced reporting, all intended to rouse anger and hatred and cause riots and anger among a public that has the capacity and the propensity to be incited and to turn to violence, all this with the ostensible blessing of the religious authority or national authority instigating the incitement. While some in Western societies might in the past have preferred to look down on localized incitement as an acceptable trait of religious culture in non-democratic, archaic or feudal societies, and even as a form of freedom of expression, the international community can now no longer dismiss modern incitement as such. The damage that has been done in molding the minds of countless children and youth to hatred, to hate Israel, to hate the Jew, and to view terrorists as role models will take many years, possibly even more than a generation, to mend. How can any normal person, whether in Leeds or Bradford or Malmö in Sweden or in Pakistan, India, Russia or in Iran against the Baha'is, and even here in the US, when faced with such a barrage of religious and media incitement, how can any normal person not be influenced in one way or another? It's the Chinese water torture that Ambassador Prosor referred to. The leadership that openly and officially sanctions and encourages such incitement can't come with clean hands to the international community and complain about a lack of progress in a peace process or in a negotiation process. Such leadership cannot come with clean hands to this organization and openly incite against Israel, a member state, and be applauded for doing so by the representatives of states, members of the organization. This organization then becomes party to the very incitement that it's committed to preventing. Now, the relevant international instrument that deals with the scourge of incitement to terror is the UN Security Council Resolution 1624 of 2005. The relevant practical measure came out of this building. It was called for by this resolution. It's regarded as indicative of the opinion of the international community, and as such, it's directed to those states and other elements involved in all aspects of seeking peace in the Middle East, including, of course, the Palestinian leadership. In its third and fourth preambular paragraphs, the resolution says the following: condemning in the strongest terms the incitement of terrorist acts and repudiating attempts at the justification or glorification of terrorist acts that might incite further terrorist acts. Deeply concerned that incitement of terrorist acts motivated by extremism and intolerance poses a serious and growing danger to the enjoyment of human rights, threatens the social and economic development of all states, undermines global stability and prosperity, and must be addressed urgently and proactively by the United Nations and all states, and emphasizing the need to take all necessary and appropriate measures in accordance with international law at the national and international level to protect the right of life. This was 2005, ladies and gentlemen. In a similar vein, the first article of the resolution itself determines the obligation placed by the Council, by the Security Council, on states, calling upon states to adopt such measures as may be necessary and appropriate and in accordance with their obligations under international law to A. prohibit by law incitement to commit a terrorist act or acts, B. to prevent such conduct, C. deny safe haven to any persons with respect to whom there is credible and relevant information giving serious reasons for considering that they have been guilty of such conduct. The third article calls upon states to continue international efforts to enhance dialogue and broaden understanding among civilizations in an effort to prevent the indiscriminate targeting of different religions and cultures, and to take all measures as may be necessary and appropriate and in accordance with their obligations under international law to counter incitement to terrorist acts motivated by extremism and intolerance, and to prevent the subversion of educational, cultural and religious institutions by terrorists and their supporters. What better mandate could come out of this organization? The United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, adopted as a resolution by the General Assembly following up on this Security Council resolution in September 2006, in an annexed plan of action, addressed the issue of measures to deal with the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, and referring to incitement, determined, quote, to continue to work to adopt such measures as may be necessary and appropriate and in accordance with our obligations under international law to prohibit by law incitement to commit a terrorist act or acts and prevent such conduct. I understand that in 2005, in fact, there was a previous conference organized here in the United Nations to address this issue, but that might possibly have been before its time. Today, with the advancement in technology, with the huge step forward in internet technology and in social networking, today now is the time that we have to take up this mandate and deal with it. And so, the draft international convention that proposed in this paper that I drafted, it represents an effort to move forward from these resolutions, from domestic legislation, and from the various regional treaties that do exist to deal with terrorism, with a view to placing before the international community a draft comprehensive instrument that attempts to address the issue of incitement and to criminalize it in international law, to determine it as an international crime, like piracy, terrorism, or other international crimes. This draft convention is based on, and I deliberately followed the accepted format of several UN international conventions and resolutions dealing with various aspects of international terror, as well as on legal articles and drafts that have been forthcoming over the years. And these include the International Convention on Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, the International Convention for the Suppression of Financing of Terrorism, the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, the Council of Europe Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism 2005, the outcome document of the Durban Review Conference 2009, UN Security Council Resolution 1624 2005, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 1966, the judgment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in the case of Akayisu, and various Security Council resolutions dealing with media incitement. Obviously, necessary changes and adaptations have been made in order to tailor this draft convention to meet the specific needs of criminalizing incitement to terror, especially in light, as I said, of the technological developments in the area of internet and electronic information transfer as a means of inciting millions of people with the press of a button on a computer. The definition of incitement to terror in Article 1 of this convention is very detailed and precise, deliberately so, and I've put a lot of thought into this, with a view to avoiding any excuse that this definition or this convention might violate freedom of speech or First Amendment rights. Clearly, only the UN is the appropriate body to process such an important convention and to turn it into an instrument of international law. It is to be hoped that this convention will now be seriously taken up by the appropriate legal bodies within the UN with a view to its adoption as soon as possible as an international convention. I had hoped to be able to present this either to the Secretary General personally or to his Under Secretary General, the legal counsel, who was scheduled to join us today, but unfortunately couldn't join us. And so I can only ask our ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Prosor, to present this to the Secretary General in the hope that this will then start the route taken by developing international law through the various UN legal bodies, the Sixth Committee, etc., so that it will, as soon as possible, become an international convention. Thank you very much.